This program is sponsored by Auckland City Council. Number 5 out of 215. Auckland's international ranking for quality of life. Professor Kohler is the founder and president of the International Progress Organisation, or IPO, an international non-governmental organisation in consultative status with the United Nations, and with a membership in over 70 countries, representing all continents. Through his research and international activities, Professor Kohler made major contributions to the debate on international democracy and United Nations reform, in particular, reform of the Security Council. This was acknowledged by international figures such as the German Foreign Minister Klaus Kinkel. In 1985, Professor Kohler organized the first major colloquium on democracy in international relations on the occasion of the 40th anniversary of the United Nations in New York. With Irish Nobel laureate Sean McBride, he initiated the appeal by lawyers against nuclear war, which set in motion an international campaign that eventually led to a General Assembly resolution and the issuing of an advisory opinion by the International Court of Justice. As president of the IPO, he dealt with the humanitarian issues of the exchange of prisoners of war between Iran and Iraq, and with the issue of Kuwaiti POWs and missing people in Iraq. Since 1972, UN Secretaries-General in their statements subsequently acknowledged Professor Kohler's contributions to international peace. In April of 2000, Secretary-General Kofi Annan appointed Professor Kohler as international observer at the Scottish Court in the Netherlands at the Lockerbie trial. He has published more than 300 books, reports, and scholarly articles in several languages. In his book, The Global War on Terror and the Metaphysical Enemy, he writes the atrocities of September 11, 2001. Instead of dealing with the contradictions and inconsistencies in the official version of events and the numerous gaps in terms of the factual information, a dogma of political correctness has been promulgated, according to which 19 Islamic-inspired Arab hijackers, directed by an elusive al-Qaeda base, succeeded in carrying out the atrocities all by themselves. During the course of his lecture, he recalled the detailed and precise questions asked on the 11th of January 2008 by Yukihisa Fujita, a member of Japan's House of Councillors, the Senate, and director of the Senate's Committee on Foreign Affairs and Defense, about the 9/11 attacks as the origin of the war on terror are a rare exception. The total silence about Mr. Fujita's intervention before the committee, that was broadcast live on Japan's public NHK television channel in the Western corporate media, is a telling example of the lack of courage in front of a powerful political establishment. Thus, a rather docile and obviously opportunistic intellectual elite in the West, in tandem with quiet regimes in the Muslim world, has effectively silenced, or at least marginalized, critical opinion.
Dr. Hans Koschler, welcome to Aotearoa. Thank you for being willing on your holiday to spend some time sharing your knowledge with us. You've talked tonight about the global war on terror. What is it that's new about terror and terrorism in the current context?
The new feature is that a kind of universal threat is now being connected to the term terrorism, and fear is instilled into the people because they are made believe that there is a threat to our Western civilization, even to the very survival of the Western community and to the preservation of identity that is emanating from this kind of elusive enemy, which is called international terrorism. And that, I think, is the new feature, because in earlier decades, in earlier eras, terrorist acts were specified and people identified certain dangers coming from certain specific groups, but now apparently this danger is somehow general and vague, and entire civilizations are presented as a threat threat to our own civilization.
So who is promoting this and why?
As far as I can see, it is promoted by the establishment, powerful political and economic establishment and media establishment in the leading countries of the Western world. On top of them, or first and foremost, the United States of America, and in addition, for instance, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and some other Western allies.
So what do they have to gain from this?
Frankly speaking, it is about global power in a situation in which there is no challenge to the Western supremacy, and particularly in which there is no real threat to the security of the Western world. I mean, after the demise of communism, after the collapse of the Soviet bloc, apparently one feels the need to create another enemy stereotype which will allow to somehow or to justify certain measures of control over the rest of the world. Usually, a government needs an enemy. People have to be rallied around the government in defense against an enemy from outside. And this threat, or the other, which is now supposedly threatening the West, is presented as terror, or as terrorism, or as the terrorists.
Now, you described this as self-defeating. Why do you think it's self-defeating?
It is finally doomed to fail because it necessitates a constant, a kind of perpetual mobilization of the people and of the resources of a country. When you present the threat as universal, and when there is no possibility to identify specifically certain groups from which the threat emerges, you have to engage in a total strategy of prevention, and you have to exclude even the slightest possibility of attack from whichever direction. That means you have to be prepared 24 hours, 7 days a week, 100%. And for that reason, somehow the strength or the capacities of the countries that engage in such an undertaking will be exhausted. And the other reason why I think that this is in the medium and long term a self-defeating exercise, the other reason is that this kind of strategy antagonizes entire nations and even peoples and civilizations in such a way that they will not feel any loyalty towards those countries that engage in that struggle, and they may challenge the supremacy of those countries, and they may be more determined in their resistance than they otherwise would be if there would be a kind of rational relationship on the basis of the definition of mutual interests, as also could be the case.
So why have politicians, political leaders, intellectual leaders in so much of the West not challenged this? You gave the example of the Japanese member of the Senate who had raised issues, and those issues had not appeared in the mainstream media. Why do you think that is occurring?
I personally feel, on the basis of my own experience now over several decades, having dealt with issues particularly of the Middle East and of the Muslim world, that most of the people in the media and in the academic community are just afraid for their own position. They do not want to somehow be marginalized, or they do not want to be sidelined, which would be the case if they speak out critically against this entire strategy. So it is a kind of opportunism, or a kind of fear which people are not able to overcome, because very often, if one really speaks out, one is confronted with quite strong media campaigns, and some people also may, the careers of some people may suffer if they do speak out.
But if we contrast that to the civil rights campaigns and the challenges that there were to the suppression of rights during 1960s, 1970s in the West, we're now seeing a revisiting of the normalisation of militarisation, of suppression of fundamental rights. What's different? Why aren't we seeing those voices of dissent now?
I think that as far as Europe is concerned, and I'm only an expert on these matters, in Europe, as far as Europe is concerned, the entire social climate, if one may use that term, is different compared to the 1960s. Also, the students in the universities nowadays are much less outspoken and are much more obedient, so to speak, as far as the politically correct opinions are concerned. But maybe the situation now has to do with a kind of overall opinion control or fear that has been instilled into the people, and no one dares to be or doesn't want to be disloyal towards his community or wants to speak out against the supreme interests of the state.
So how would you relate this, say, to Palestine, where we see the stories of killings and maimings every day, where we see the deprivation of the basic necessities of life, of access to water and to electricity and to food? How do you interpret, analyse the situation in Palestine and the responses to it within your framework of thinking?
As far as I understand it, I have followed the developments in Palestine since the 1970s. That means now since more than 3 decades. As far as I see it, most of what you refer to now, most of the events are not adequately presented to the wider public. Most of the people would just not know what is really going on. The news are filtered through the corporate media. If people would really be aware of the situation people live in, under which people live in, for instance, the Gaza Strip, there would be some stronger and critical position against the policies, for instance, of the Western countries. But as far as I see, there is a lack of comprehensive information. And the other problem, as far as Palestine is concerned, is this linkage with Islam as a threat, and particularly terrorism. The linkage of Islam and terrorism.
So when you're looking at the way that Western states respond to the use of force to suppress resistance movements, freedom fighters, terrorists, however they're defined by one side or the other, what are the factors that you think drive the decisions of states? Now, can I put that in the local context?
Yeah.
Our government here, for example, had no problem with recognising the general who led the coup in Thailand, right? The military government there, the government here was perfectly happy to deal with. Had no problems dealing with Musharraf in Pakistan. Mbani Marama, the leader of the military coup in Fiji, is ostracised. There are sanctions against anyone in the military, including Boy Scouts who wanted to come to a jamboree whose family members happened to be part of the military. What are the kinds of considerations that you think drive the differential responses of Western leaders to regimes that are actually very similar in their particular style and in the suppression of rights attached to it?
I would use here the term of the policy of double standards. A government applies certain principles of legality or certain criteria of the rule of law selectively according to the specific constellation of interests. And so it is no surprise to me. Of course, I was not aware of I'm not aware of the specific policies of the government here, but it is of no surprise to me to see that the government applies certain principles or insists on the implementation of certain principles in one case and totally overlooks them. Of course, in the neighborhood, there may be different interests and different from the interests which a country may have vis-à-vis countries that are far away, and that constellation is the explanation why one insists on certain rules in this case and does not insist on certain rules in other cases. Of course, that creates a credibility problem, but I do not know, frankly speaking, up to the present moment, I do not know a single government which really would be consistent in the application of principles and which would avoid in its foreign policy so-called policy of double standards.
Well, the New Zealand government also has made great play out of the fact that it did not join the coalition of the willing in the invasion of Iraq. But it's there in Afghanistan. Does that sound a convincing clean hands kind of principled approach to you, or do you have problems with that kind of differentiation?
In terms of legal doctrine, I would say I would have problems with this kind of differentiation, but one could say, first of all, the government of New Zealand made a good decision in not sending troops to Iraq. Many of the governments that joined the coalition of the willing regret this by now, and some of them have already withdrawn their troops. So the government here was lucky in having not fallen into that trap. But as far as legal principles are concerned, in my view, the interventions in both countries, in Iraq as well as in Afghanistan, are violations of the sovereignty of those countries. And both interventions are not duly justified or legitimized by international law. Even in the case of Afghanistan, there is no authorization of the intervention by American and NATO forces in that country.
So do you think international law has now become so devalued that it's no longer actually defendable in many of those instances, or do you think it's a recoverable concept that might still have some value if it can be removed from the grip of the Security Council?
I don't know. Eventually it may be already beyond repair, so to speak. The big problem I see is that in a situation, in a global constellation in which there is no balance of power, there is absolutely no incentive for the hegemonial country to abide by the rule of law or to obey the law. There is no incentive, for instance, for that country to respect Security Council resolutions. On the other way, because of the veto, this country, like four others, can block any decision by that council at any moment. But as far as Afghanistan is concerned, the situation went even that far that, for instance, my own country, the Republic of Austria, which according to its constitution is permanently neutral, according to the Swiss model, even my country has sent forces, though in a very small number, but sent forces to Afghanistan. Of course, the people say that this is not compatible with a status of permanent neutrality. It never can be compatible. But these things happen now, and one is just reinterpreting terms according to the political constellation of interests at a given moment.
So what's your sense of what might happen in Iran? What's your fear of what might happen?
I did fear that the United States, together with their ally in the Middle East, plus one or two European countries, might militarily intervene in Iran. And that was, according to my knowledge, also the plan of the United States administration 2 years ago, 1 year ago. What I see now is that the intelligence services of that very country have expressed an opinion that is contradicting the strategy of the President of the United States. So my hope now is that the US is reconsidering its war plans against Iran, and that it will not attack Iran, because that would totally destabilize not only the situation in the Middle East, but the situation far beyond that region.
You've stressed a lot on the foreign policy and ideological interests. The economic interests are also integral to this, not only in the Middle East, but in the way that many economies are now becoming almost dependent on the perpetual war, or certainly many aspects of economies are. Fiji, yes, where you're going to go tomorrow, the Fiji economy is dependent on remittances. Almost 90% of those remittances come from security workers operating in Iraq. You have an economy that becomes dependent on war, and when people come back, bring a militarisation back into the country itself. Do you see any similar kinds of militarisation of economy within Europe and America that might want to keep perpetuating this process?
As far as Europe is concerned, I do not yet see that tendency firmly established. In the United States, it appears obvious to me that there is a kind of self-perpetuating situation, and that the economic interests lead to the involvement of the country in military adventures. As far as our countries in the European Union are concerned, I think we have not yet reached that stage. The military-industrial complex in most of the European countries is much less strong, much less developed than it is in the United States.
Just one last question. You've become aware that terrorism has become a domestic issue in this country, with arrests that were in part under the Terrorism Suppression Act, with most of those arrested being Māori sovereignty activists. Do you see the global war on terror as actually having an internal dimension that legitimises the use of state power against its own dissident internal factions as much as against the other in the global context? And how, in that sense, do you think we might connect the domestic realities to the international experiences?
I am in this country only since very short time, so I'm not so familiar with the internal political situation. However, I do hope that a distinction will be made between tensions that may exist domestically and the international issues related to the so-called global war on terror. As of the present moment, I do not see any connection between what is going on here, between the government and the representatives of the native population of New Zealand, and the war on terror. And I just hope that no one will exploit this extremely emotional climate surrounding the global war on terror for internal domestic politics or for internal security measures. One thing, the one situation has to be kept totally separate from the other.
Thank you very much for your time. We wish you safe travels and we look forward to seeing you back here again before too long.
You're welcome.
This program was sponsored by Auckland City Council. 185. The number of ethnic groups in Auckland City. 38. The percentage of Auckland residents who were not born in New Zealand.